Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to help celebrate the library's 50th anniversary. This year, we've been trying to do little things to show our appreciation for the town of Speedway, special programs and little gifts to say we're very happy that you make us a part of your lives, because we love this town and we're glad you make us your library. So this year, we're going to start off our celebration the way lots of birthdays start out, with presents. And the first present will be from the Speedway Town Council, a proclamation for our library. So we'll have President of the Town Council, Jeff Matthews, and also council members, Mr. Lindsay and Mr. Rakes.
Please hold your applause. Good afternoon, everyone. This is, if you guys want to come over here.
Sure. Excuse me. Get on both sides.
All right. Whereas the Speedway Public Library officially opened on November 24th, 1968, bringing to life a dream come true for a dedicated, diligent, hardworking woman, Betty Thompson. Her vision for the library was for it to become a hub of knowledge and a cultural gathering place. Whereas Betty Thompson presented a petition for a new library containing 1,572 signatures to the Speedway Town Council on May 24th, 1965. And whereas on October 25th, 1965, Ray Oath, town clerk, swore in the newly formed library board of trustees consisting of Jack Fuller, there you are, Sue Whitmore, Edith Griffin, Fred Cipher, Agnes Spencer, Betty Thompson, and Donald Tyler. Whereas the Speedway Public Library currently has 90,000 items in its collection, including fictional and informational books, popular magazines, books on tape, music on CDs, electronic databases, and of course, books on automobile racing. Donald, have anything with that? And whereas the Speedway Public Library offers many programs, including summer reading clubs for adults and children, book discussions, story time for children, craft programs, summer concerts for families, and an annual Christmas party for families. Whereas the Speedway Public Library provides digital learning resources and workbooks to aid the Speedway School Corporation's students in their homework assignments, and offers testing proctor services to the Speedway adult learners and those Speedway residents who are enrolled in college courses. Now, therefore, I, Jeff Matthews, by virtue of the authority vested in me as president of the Town of Speedway Town Council, do hereby proclaim November 17th, 2018 as the Speedway Public Library Day in the town of Speedway, Indiana, dated this day, 17th of November, 2018. Thank you.
And since we're 50, we should have another present, of course, and from our very own Speedway Town Council representative, Marilyn Pfisterer.
Thank you so very much, and I think it's a tribute to the library that all of you are here today. It shows how integrated this library is in the community. It's become a staple, I think, in the community. As in my experience, it's absolutely a staple in the community. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Board for all the efforts that they put forth. I've been here on book sale weekends, and oh my goodness, I see all those books, and I know it took a lot of time to get those sorted and crated and brought in here. So there is such a dedication and a spirit of support here in Speedway that I think is unique in the United States. The community is welcome here. In the community room, there have been charrettes that show that depict the development that's going on in Speedway, another way that it's integrated, and there are partnerships with other organizations to make the breadth of support in Speedway possible. I've been a member of this Speedway Library for quite some time, and I appreciate those late night readings that keep me awake all night with those mystery books. Those tapes that help me get through long trips with a pleasure, with enjoyment, and with learning. And the smiles from the staff each time I come in. There's always a smile and a greeting and how can I help you? So it is my pleasure today to present a City County Council proclamation that reads, whereas the Speedway Public Library is celebrating 50 years of service to the town of Speedway, and whereas prior to the establishment of the Speedway Library, residents were without adequate library resources, and the Speedway High School Library was relatively new and in the process of expanding to fulfill its mission of serving the students. And whereas Speedway Library opened in November 24th, 1968 because of one woman's dream. That says to me, woman power. It was her dream, her drive, and her enthusiasm. Mrs. Allen C. Betty Thompson richly deserves credit and is as the individual who initiated the drive, dedicating more than 3 years of work, thought, and effort to accomplish the completion of the Speedway Public Library. And whereas today, the Speedway Public Library has over 70,000 items. I don't think I've gone through quite that many. Besides popular fiction and informational books on automobile racing are collected as a special interest to patrons. Speedway Public Library also provides popular magazines, books on tape, music CDs, DVDs, electronic databases, public internets, and a wireless network, and I see that being used almost every day I'm in here. Homework help is also provided and is sponsored by a bequest from Gladys J. Sigelmuller? Okay, I was hoping I would pronounce it correctly, and a grant from Praxair. And whereas many programs are sponsored by the Friends of Speedway Public Library Support Group through book sales, racing day parking, day bus trips, and other fundraisers. The Friends also sponsor quality programming so that public funds are used for materials and other vital services, and whereas Speedway Public Library has adapted to the changes in technology that has redefined what is known as a library, while maintaining the comfort and respect associated with collections of books and the information and inspiration they contain. Now therefore be it proclaimed by the City County Council of Indianapolis and of Marion County, Indiana, Section 1, Councilors Marilyn Feaster and Janice Henry, who couldn't be here today, recognize the 50th anniversary of the Speedway Public Library. Section 2, the City County Council of Indianapolis appreciate and respect the wonderful work of library board members, staff, and volunteers of the Speedway Library. And it is signed by Councilors McHenry, myself, and the Clerk of the Court. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be a very small part of this very special day. Darcy, I have extra proclamations, one for publication and one for your records.
Great.
And also a
Oh,
pin
thank
from the
you.
City County Council.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So, do we pose for a picture?
We could pose for a picture.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll leave this here.
Okay, well, for 50th anniversary, people do things big. So we're going to start really big and blow our own horn. We want to say a special thank you to our founder's son, Jeff Thompson, for being here, and all our other really prestigious people that are in the audience. We have Mr. Fuller's daughter here. We have Mr. Bloom, who helped build the library bigger. We have lots of former board members, so I'd like to say thank you all for coming. And let's start it off with a big round of tunes from the Gordon Pipers. Here they come.
Thank you. We're very privileged to be here and celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Speedway Public Library. As I was telling Darcy before, I lived over on the other side, Meadowood Park, and used to ride my bicycle here to the old library before they added on the addition when I was in college. So didn't get to visit it much afterwards, but all it has a fond memory in my heart. So we'd like to play another tune for you, please. Are you shy, Snicket Dan? Play some drums at the halt by the center. Slow march.
very much. We're the Indianapolis 500 Gordon Pipers, formed in 1962. Been playing at the Speedway since '63. That's Ken Evans, who grew up in Speedway. Okay, and you're celebrating what? The 50th? Connie, step forward, please. This is Connie Summers, and she is celebrating her 50th anniversary with the Indianapolis 500 Gordon Pipers. Her husband normally plays bass, but he's preoccupied tonight. Her daughter is one of our star dancers and tenor drummers, and her grandson is also now playing the tenor drum. That's all I have.
Usually he's a lot more glib than this. Should I say talkative? All right, so we're going to leave you at this time, and we'll play a tune very uplifting, Bonnie Dundee.
We're not going to play Stump the Bagpipers? Is there any requests? No? That's good.
All right, pipes and drums.
Track, everybody.
Bonnie Dundee. All right, quick, march.
I bet no one's reading quietly right now in the library. Well, what could be better for our library to celebrate the birthday than with someone who knows the track better than anyone else and someone who's a fabulous storyteller. So we're very fortunate to have the official historian of the IMS here, Mr. Donald Davidson.
Oh, very nostalgic. The pipes. I'm actually three-quarters Scottish. My mother was Scottish born and raised, and my dad was about 50% Scottish, so I'm about three-quarters. Hope you can hear me okay, because I don't project very well. Is it reasonable enough? Okay. And so, more? No, I'm okay, good. I got my sound check guy in the back there. But yeah, very, very nostalgic. Maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but it really stirs my blood to hear the pipes. And because of my mother's upbringing, the Edinburgh tattoo was always a big deal. In fact, we were actually in Scotland visiting her relatives one time when the tattoo was on. As far as happy birthday, library, by the way. And libraries have always been huge in my life. We would go when we were kids, and when it really struck me was when I was about 13, 14, when I first got interested in motor racing, and there was motor racing books at the library. And the Salisbury Public Library, I was born in a town called Salisbury, in about 90 miles southwest of London, and that's where Salisbury Cathedral is. Stonehenge is about 8 or 9 miles up the road, and very historical town, as are most of the English towns. Salisbury Cathedral was built in 1220. And so when you get buildings over here, like, I never understood this, Riverfront Stadium, that was a new ballpark, and they already tore it down and built another one. And they're talking about Madison Square Garden. I think there's been 5 of those. One Salisbury Cathedral built in 1220, and that's actually the new one to replace the one that was there before that, which was dismantled. And if any of you have been to Salisbury, visited the cathedral, it's inside an area called the Close, and it's walled. It's not a fort, but it's a high walled, sealed off area where clergymen and school teachers and so on and so forth live. And I didn't know, because I didn't pay attention. My interest was in Indianapolis, and I didn't care what was going on around me. And it wasn't until I took my kids back, my 2 oldest kids, when they got out of junior high, I took them to England, and I only learned then that the wall that surrounded the cathedral area, and I actually went to school. You thought I was going to talk about motor racing? No such luck. I went to Bishop Wordsworth School, which was actually inside the Close. There were 2 schools in there, the Cathedral School and Bishop Wordsworth Grammar School, and that's where I went. And I'm not making this up. My English teacher for 2 years was William Golding, and his nickname was Scruff. And anyway, I could tell you stories about that. But anyway, I did not realize until I went back with my kids that the wall that surrounds the cathedral area was actually built out of the stones from the dismantled original Salisbury Cathedral. And so that was dismantled in, I don't know, 1200 or something like that. And then they stored the bricks at the old mill, and then when the cathedral job was completed and they put up this wall, they used the stones from the original cathedral. There's a market which is held every Tuesday and Saturday by royal decree from back at the time the cathedral was built. And so when the Yanks come to Salisbury and they go to the market and think, well, this is great. How long has this been going on? Oh, about 800 years. So, no, actually it'd be more than that now. But anyway, so while I was going to Bishop School, at lunchtime, I would sneak down to the Salisbury Public Library and read the motor racing books, the magazines, the motoring weeklies. I could read it for nothing. I mean, what a hell of a deal a library is, right? I mean, is it a great deal or not? And observation made about some of the librarians. It seems to me that librarians all over the place are amongst the happiest people that you could meet, because they just enjoy what they do. And so in our years here, living in, not always in Speedway, I wanted to live in Speedway to begin with, but we couldn't afford it, so I had to work up from Eagledale and down on North Berwick, which used to be okay, and it was very handy for the white front, which is now not the white front anymore. But so it took a while before we could get into Speedway, but I did actually, for several years, I lived in a house where the apartments are now. I don't know if this is the kind of thing that you want to hear. How many people are Speedway residents of 50 years plus? All right, very good. So I'll be directing my next few moments with these people, and just to bring back a few memories. I mean, the post office used to be, it was been a number of different things, and it's closed right now, but very nostalgic, because I worked at USAC, and I could walk down to the post office just down the road, and Speedway Savings and Loan, and First Bank and Trust, and now I'm going through remorse because the Chase Bank closed. Yeah, and I can't tell you, that's really difficult from a personal point of view. It's closed now, but when we got the notice for that, I found that difficult. In fact, I've got tears in my eyes right now because we'd just gone there for so long and it was so handy. But anyway, we don't know what's going to happen there. But anyway, I remember when the post office just down the road was built, and then of course the library. So my wife was a very prolific reader. She'd read a book a day, and quite early on she made the observation, and I don't know whether this was intended or not, but she said, it's really be great for the kids, because when they were toddlers, and she said, and I'm reading all the time, and I'm smiling. And so I think the kids got the idea early on that reading must be fun, whatever Mom's doing there. And you can't believe the stuff she read. She would read these horrible Gothic novels with, she'd buy these books and the front cover sort of like a skull with bloods coming out of it. And anyway, so that was one of her things. So, but we've spent a lot of time over here, and I loved the library because of just nosing through the books and all the sales, for heaven's sake. I don't know how many. Just lined up and down here, all of the showbiz books I bought. I love biographies and autobiographies of the film stars, and I've got those piled up to the ceiling at the house, and some of them I've actually read. And you know how that is? You look at the pictures and say, yes, I want this. And one of these centuries, I'm gonna get to them. But CDs. LP records, jigsaw puzzles. I'm a jigsaw puzzle aficionado. Don't have a chance to do them very often, but I bought a ton of jigsaws in here. But and then just not only spending time when the kids were little, they were across the way, and they were thoroughly entertained. In fact, it was sort of. A little difficult to get them out of here when we'd have to, the library was getting ready to close, and we'd say, well, nighty sleep, library. Then we go home, and but anyway, so I'm rambling all over the place here, but lots of great memories, and what a wonderful gift a library is, especially if you're a cheapo like me. So, but anyway, so. Thanks for the memories, Speedway Public Library. What I plan to do here is, I think if it's okay, I just like to do Q&A rather than just force stuff upon you, which I've just done for the last 10 minutes or so. I like to do Q&A, and so if it's okay with you, I will entertain until we've had enough, just about anything that you want to discuss, except, and I think some of you are familiar with my usual disclaimers, I don't like controversy. And I picked a heck of a subject to become interested in because, I don't know, for those of you that follow it, once in a while there's been a controversy over there at the Indianapolis Speedway. Like every year. And it never goes away. And I've got this theory a long time ago. When it's at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it's forever, and it never goes away. And the drivers that I've known well, that have confided in me, and you can probably fill in a lot of the blanks here, the drivers that have had really illustrious careers, really substantial careers, and to be some unfortunate thing happened at the Speedway involving them, and that's all anybody remembers. And so I really feel for those guys. But anyway, so I'm really not into controversy. I'm not a gearhead. I'm not a techie. I'm really about the people and the personalities. And so I have to be a little careful with if you're asking me for personal points of view. I have to sort of be a little bit careful because I do work for the track, and some of the opinions expressed herein are not necessarily those of the management, and I don't want to get into trouble for saying the wrong thing at the right time or the right thing at the wrong time. So basically, that knocks a lot of the questions out. So if you want to, if you got questions about the turbines, no, ain't going there. I just really would prefer to do, just to talk about the people. Yes, ma'am.
Could you, in honor of the library's founding year, could you give us your favorite memory about a driver or an incident in 1968?
Well, the turbines were running there. Well, actually, yeah, no anecdotes are really coming to mind. I mean, Bobby Unser won the race. Joe Leonard was leading late with a turbine, and it broke down, and Bobby Unser in 1968 was very different from the Bobby Unser that would come along later, and it was almost like he was the knight in shining armor that triumphed over the wicked and turbines, in some of our eyes. So he was a very bright young winner at the time. On lap 9, Jim Hurtubise was out with a burned piston, and when his car was pushed through to make the left-hand turn through the gate and into the garage area, that was the last time that a front engine car would participate in the race. So a little bit sad there. I tell you what, here's a neat story from 1968. Mel Kenyon from up in Lebanon, Indiana, was actually from Davenport, Iowa. He'd lived for a number of years, and then he and his brother relocated to Lebanon because they didn't want to be in Indianapolis, but close by. So they got a little compound, which they still have. And so anyway, Mel had a very serious accident in June of 1965. He'd actually been at the Speedway in 1965 with a front-engine roadster, qualified and got bumped. Boo. And then a month later, he was very severely injured in an accident at Langhorne, Pennsylvania. And it sounds a little bit gruesome here, but he did suffer burns, and there was a couple of operations, and it meant actually losing all of the fingers on his left hand. But he was determined to race again, and he and his brother and his dad devised this system whereby he could continue driving. And they designed a glove, and the glove would fit over the wrist, and then somebody would have to tie the thing so that the glove wouldn't come off. And in the palm of the glove, there was a rubber grommet. And on the steering wheel, there would be a stud. This is mostly for midgets. And so he would grab the wheel with the right hand and then put his palm, and imagine this with no fingers, he put the palm on the stud and then would drive like this. And he was out for a few months and spent some time down at the San Antonio Burn Center, but they fixed him up. And the following spring, he's back to running midgets again. And I'm making a long story out of this, but it's amazing what he was able to accomplish. And he said, actually, I've got the advantage over some of my colleagues, because if we're like running indoors on a really tight track, and he said, and I'm in a position where I need to get out of there in a hurry, he said, I take my right hand off, and I can work the wheel like that, and my colleagues can't do that. Well, anyway, it took some talking, but he was able to pass the physical at the Speedway because there was some concern that they wouldn't let him drive doing this. And dear Dr. Thomas Hanna was still the MD at that time, and so it took a little bit of politicking, but they gave him the okay. So he finished, it was 66, was a lot of cars were taken out at the start, and he ended up fifth, a rather distant fifth, but still top 10 finish, and a lot of people went through their career and never had a top 10 finish. So we'll come around to then the next year, well, I'll skip that. It comes into the spring of 1968, and Thermo King was the sponsor, and there was Fred Gerhard was the car owner, and he said he called Mel and Don together and said, look, we've got Thermo King for a sponsor, but there's only enough money to do 2 cars. And he said, I don't have enough money to put it on the car that you were going to drive. But he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. The car is yours. All of the equipment is yours. If you can find a sponsor, you guys run it. And so Mel and Don went to Bob Campbell, who was the mayor of Lebanon, and said, and he was on their crew. He was their refueling guy. This was a thing about 1968 and for a number of years after. It was fascinating to find out the occupation of the race day crews. Now, the team, all the members, they're all engineers and everything, and they're full-time. But a lot of the Speedway personnel in the pits used to be volunteers. And on the tech committee and on the crews, there'd be doctors. I think one year there were 5 Indiana mayors that were all involved on race day, either doing on the tech committee, and Bob Campbell was their refueling guy. And so they determined to run for the month. $15,000 would get them through the month. Now, some of the teams now spend that on lunch for their gas, you know, and but things were different in those days. So they set out to raise $15,000, and Don told me that I think they ended up with 11,000, and a lot of it was little, you know, the local stores and individuals, and it was 25 and 100, and maybe somebody would put a couple of thousand, and they called it the City of Lebanon Special. And they had a bit of a problem qualifying, but rather than go into that, because it was a little bit technical, but they ended up making the show. And all of the crew were volunteer. The only person that was paid was Don Kenyon as chief mechanic and team manager, and I think he got $150 a week. Mel had made a deal whereby he would get 40% of the prize money, but there was no retainer. Now this is the amazing thing. I might be able to use up my whole time with this one question. Mel was the engine man. They didn't have engine leases in those days. They had a turbocharged Offie, and Mel was the only person that worked on that engine. And he would tear it down and put it back together and did all of the preparation himself. You have a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, wait. Go ahead. Finish your story.
I'm still on this one. Does it pertain to this?
Yeah, it's something different than that.
Somebody will have to relay me.
Different question.
It's what now?
Different question.
Oh, all right. Well, hang on, because I got a little way to go here, but I will try to hurry it along. But these are the kind of things I like to talk about, because it's amazing. So Mel would tear down the engine and put it back together himself, bearing in mind that only 3 years before he'd lost all the fingers on the one hand, but he did all of the work himself. and he was not paid anything. His whole thing was that he was going to get 40% of the prize money. So if they'd missed the show, as driver and engine builder, he would have got nothing. Well, they made the show, and as the day wore on and cars dropped out and Mel drove his very steady Eddie race, he ended up third. It was a phenomenal story. And so anyway, that was one of the heartwarmers from 1968. And I could probably think of a few more things. And you're sorry you asked the question, but bless your heart. Yes, sir. Your question, and you'll have to yell or have somebody relay it to me.
Okay. How about, do you know which two 500 drivers in the early 1950s swapped wives?
Somebody give, what was the question?
Which two early 1950-ish drivers
Yes.
swapped wives?
Oh, I think I know where you're going, and actually that did not happen. Poncho, you're talking about Dwayne Carter and Johnny Parsons Sr. All right. Johnny Parsons Sr.'s first wife divorced him and married Dwayne Carter. And so Poncho, Johnny Parsons, and his sister Joni, who's married to Jim Voiles, the attorney, and Poncho Carter. Poncho and Johnny were born to the same mother, but different fathers. But I get that all the time, and I thought where you might be going with that, but no, they did not swap wives. Is that what you wanted there?
Well, those were the two names I was looking for.
All right.
I wasn't sure you knew them.
Okay. No, Dwayne Carter did not. Dwayne Carter married Johnny Parsons' ex. Johnny did not marry Dwayne Carter's ex. All right. Yes, sir.
1968, the year they made the movie Winning?
1968.
Oh, 68.
1968 was Winning. Yes. Were you in that? No, I'm serious about this because what they did, it was released in 1969, early 69, but it was shot during the summer of 68. And they actually, not only did they hire extras, but they paid them. And a lot of people, I don't know if is anybody in the room that did that? Okay, as I recall, and I was around at that time, but I didn't go over there. Everybody that sat in the stands and spent the day there, I think it was $10 a day, plus they fed you. And they would move you around from time to time, depending on which grandstand that they were shooting. And so if you pay real attention, you could see people jumping around, and they from shot to shot, they're all in the different grandstands. But I know a lot of people went over there, and ladies would sort of take their knitting and embroidery and just work until it was time for the shot, and action please. And it's really fun to be able to spot a lot of the Speedway employees at that time. I mean, there was ladies that were in the ticket department. You think, oh, there's so-and-so. Oh, there's so-and-so. But originally, they were going to shoot it in the spring. And but at that time, and I'm bringing this up myself, because turbines had come so close to winning in 67, and in 68 it was an unknown. And Roger Ward was the technical advisor. And they talked it over, and they decided that they wanted the winner to be, everything to be very, very topical. And they said, well, we don't know, what's going to win here. If it's a turbine, we want to have the Frank Capua, who was Paul Newman, to be in something that's current. We don't want the thing to be out of date before it comes out. And so they decided, well, let's wait. And so it wasn't shot until after the 500. Now, there's a telltale shot fairly near the beginning when the Paul Newman character arrives by helicopter. Well, that's a little ahead of its time because nobody was really doing that. Roger Ward was delivered on race morning in 1962, and that's a whole other story, that actually arrived by helicopter, but that happened at Watkins Glen, but not at the Indianapolis Speedway. Well, in 1968, although the race was fine, there was a lot of weather problems. And they lost some qualifying time, and there were days when there was mud and vehicles trying to get that really tore up the infield. And Clarence Cagle wanted the Speedway to look like a golf course at all time. He wanted everything. I mean, they didn't want any trash, and back when there was such a thing as the corner of 16th and Georgetown, which there isn't anymore, in front of the old building. I remember that Clarence Cagle would be out on a little tiny sweeper himself, and when the race was over and all the trash and beer cans and stuff, normally it was all done within a day or two. He wanted the place to be pristine. So anyway, they had all this problems with cars getting stuck in the mud and everything. And so when the race was over and they started to shoot, the infield was all torn up. And if you watch Winning, when that chopper lands right next to the old garage area, this huge cloud of dust goes up. And I think of Clarence Cagle when I think of that, because he would have been mortified that the track would look so just, well, crappy, for want of a better term, in the movie. But I don't know if I've really got any other stories about that, but I just know that typically if you're an extra or you have a minor acting role, or you're supposed to walk back and forth while the two principals are having conversation, you normally get paid. But the rank and file like to sit in the grandstands all day and not have to do anything. Normally you wouldn't be paid. And I know that some people were getting $10 a day plus a meal. I don't know, is there anybody here do you have any stories about doing that?
Yeah, Paul Newman, when he was driving the race car around the track, we were filming it with a Lincoln convertible that was just like the one that John F. Kennedy got shot in, that had the entire side of the car cut off. And Newman was actually going maybe 20 miles an hour. But when you see the movie, it looks like he's doing 200.
That car, they actually took the doors off of the left-hand side, and they had a platform. And I can't think of the name of the cameraman now, but normally the chief photographer doesn't do any stunt work. But I can't remember his name now. But anyway, the guy that was the chief photographer actually lay out on that platform with the camera, and Roger Ward drove the car. So in all of the mock racing shots, the camera car is being driven by Roger Ward. Another thing too is that I don't know if Paul Newman had any interest in racing or not, but during the making of the film, it bit him. And as I say, I never did come over. I was working for USAC, but on the last day of shooting, Henry Banks went over there and gave an honorary driver's license, an honorary USAC championship driver's license to Paul Newman and to Robert Wagner. And when he came back, he said, he said, that Paul Newman's really interested. He said, Robert Wagner, just so fine, it was just another thing. But he said, Paul Newman came up to me and said, what do I have to do to get a real one of these? and Henry said, do a lot more in motor racing than you have so far. And then, by golly, he went off, and then the next thing you knew, he was an SCCA driver and running Trans Am and everything, and was really serious about it. And just a little editorial. I thought it was class on Paul Newman's part that with all of his wealth and clout, I don't know that he ever drove what we now call an Indy car. I mean, he went off and raced, but he never sort of pushed his weight around, and I think he probably recognized his limitations, and he was successful. I mean, he won sports car races, but he never tried to do it at Indianapolis, and maybe part of that was contractual with insurance and so on and so forth, but I don't know that he ever tried to push the issue. So just a little editorial comment there. And I know that room 212 is where Joanne Woodward and Robert Wagner performed an indiscretion when Paul Newman comes back and discovers them. And so I don't know whatever happened to those numbers, but I know that was kind of like bragging rights, was to see if you could get room 212, because that's where that was. And they actually shot it at the motel. And then you'll notice also that they did make a modification that, and this is probably more than you wanted to know on this, but they put up a special staircase, because in order to be able to access that room for real, you would do it from the front. You had to go around to to the south side of the building, which was facing 16th Street, and then go up a stair to come up on the other side on the balcony, on the side that's where the pool was and everything. And in order to save a little time, they did a modification to put like a staircase on the north side. So I don't know if that makes any sense or not. And well, I got any other thoughts about that?
I have a story.
They'll come to me when I go home. You've got a story about me?
We were living in the parsonage across the alley from Speedway Christian Church, and we were feeding a pretty large dog, a stray that was in the neighborhood.
Yes.
And you came walking up the alley, and this dog that we had named Pete bit your hand. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Well, he later bit my father, and he had to be put down. But
I do not remember that.
it happened. We felt terrible.
How long ago was that?
Would have been in '73, maybe.
I just thought of something. I went off on a tangent, so I'll come back to where I was a little while ago. When I was first working at USAC I'll date myself a little bit, from June of '66 until around August of '69, and in fact, when I was married, we lived on the corner of 16th and Auburn, where the apartments are now. There was a big old house in the back. There was a wonderful front garden with trellis works and roses and everything like that. And the garage was sort of like a big old barn from about the turn of the century. And this house was at the back of the property, right up against the alleyway. And there was a lady and her daughter lived downstairs, and I lived with my young bride upstairs. And so then we got the word that it was going to be demolished and made into apartments. And so we moved out in right about September of '69, and that job got delayed. I think that building sat there for maybe another 18 months or a couple of years before they finally knocked it down to put up the apartments that are there now. But anyway, that's where I lived, and it was real handy for USAC. And I could never understand these people that would work at the track and live at Geist Reservoir or whatever it was. I was always about living close to work. And that was very handy because I didn't even need the car. I would just walk back. In fact, at lunchtime, sometimes I'd go back to the house and take a nap. But it was always very, very handy. And we decided that when we started having kids, we'd want them to go to Speedway. And it took a little negotiating before we finally were able to get back. And then in 1977, we moved into the house that we are now. And very handy for the kids to go to Carl G. Fisher Elementary School, and then the junior high. And everything was so handy there with the police station and the fire station and the town hall, and wonder how much longer that's going to last. Oh, just have to wait and see on that one. So, all right. Anybody got a question that will require a short answer or a shorter answer?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You kind of stole part. I had one question, but when you talked a little bit about Roger Ward, I think, because he was going to be who I'd asked, but do you have anything on A.J. Foyt?
Anything on A.J. Foyt? Well, by the way, Roger Ward, just a couple on Roger Ward. He briefly lived just down the street here. If you go out of here and turn left to go back down to where the post office is now, those buildings that are on the south side, one of those, Roger Ward lived there very briefly. So he said, my residence is Speedway, Indiana. And then for a while, he was a member of the Speedway Christian Church. Foyt, as far as he actually lived in the Fisher Apartments on 10th Street for a short time, and then he moved out to Westlake, and in fact was actually in the phone book. But as far as Foyt, golly, there's a zillion Foyt stories.
What one do you like?
Well, from a local point of view, Foyt was considered tempestuous and had this reputation for having a short temper. You ever see Parnelli Jones when he was mad? Yes, a couple of you? And you never heard about that. Parnelli could get furious. But anyway, the thing about Foyt is that very early on, he was very generous behind the scenes and always made sure that an injured driver was taken care of, and all of the, the bills were paid, and if somebody was stranded at a racetrack, that they'd have some money to get them through. I don't know if I explained that very well, but in the later years, when A.J. Watson was beginning to fail a little bit, and so whatever year this was, and the recent years run together for me, but I think, was it maybe 3 years ago, I think, when, anyway, so the family were all at the house, and early May, there was a knock on the door, and it was Foyt. And he said, I just got into town, and he said, I just wanted to, they said, oh no, come in. He said, no. He said, I just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. If you need anything, call me. And so they said, well, actually, he's having a pretty good day. Come on in. And so he went into the house, and Watson came out, and they started telling stories, and they got out photographs, and I guess Foyt stayed there for like an hour and a half. And then, but as he left, he hugged Joyce and said, if you need anything, just let me know. I think he went back 2 more times, and on the opening weekend of the track, they had for about 3 years, there was an event. It was sort of a concours d'elegance, but they called it the Celebration of Automobiles. And they'd have a special guest that would be the honorary chief judge or whatever it was, and then there would be a dinner on the Saturday night, and there would be a program involving the guest and or guests, and with a little discussion moderated by somebody that talks too much and should get on with the story. So anyway, Al Unser was not going to be able to be here for the race, but he came in to be the honorary guest for the celebration of automobiles, and then so Saturday night was the dinner. The next morning he's going to go back to Albuquerque, but he went to Charlie Brown's and for breakfast, and Foyt eats there whenever he's in town. In fact, there's even it's called the Foyt booth, which he has over in the corner, and Foyt is a regular at Charlie Brown's. And so somebody sent me this wonderful photograph, and it was Foyt at Al Unser's booth, deep in conversation, and basically what he was saying was, you better go over and see Watson because he's getting frail. And so somebody said they said if my calculations are correct, this is 8 wins with Foyt talking to Al Unser. So anyway, Al then went over to see Watson, and then headed back to Albuquerque, and I think Watson passed away the next day. But anyway. There's a side to Foyt. He has mellowed a lot, but tempestuous is probably a good term. But just a very behind the scenes, very, very generous person. That's probably not the story you were hoping to hear, but yes, sir.
I know drivers used to live at Speedway during the race, during May. In the last 50 years, were there any drivers that you know of that during their off time would come to the Speedway library and read?
I was thinking about that, and I can't remember actually seeing a driver in the library. I would imagine that some of them came with their kids because, and I'm not going to give any addresses because I think that's private, but yes, a lot of drivers would live with a family or be in the basement or something. Well, normally the crew would be in the basement and the drivers would get the guest room. And then sometimes the wife and the kids would come back for the race. And then the driver, then they may go back after the race, and then the driver would stay here for the rest of the summer. And normally the Hoosier 100 and the 100 at Terre Haute, and then they would go back. But I was going to go somewhere with this, and I'm going to have to stop and get my thoughts.
Drivers who were readers. Do you know of any drivers who were readers?
Any drivers that?
Drivers who were active readers. Active readers. Like to read.
Oh, active readers. There was a driver named Tommy Kopp, who was a midget car driver that tried to qualify for the 500 and never did. And he would read westerns and detective stories constantly. I'm sure there were some. Oh, I did. Here's a little trivia question, because at one time, drivers would walk to the track. Vukovich lived with Lawrence. Well, I said I wouldn't give any addresses, but when Lawrence Thompson was the principal of the high school, I think, because I'm trying to think when the high school was on 14th Street, and Vukovich stayed there and would walk over on race day. In 1950, Johnny Parsons and Jack McGrath were staying, I think, on like 13th Street or something like that. They walked over. So there were several drivers that actually walked on race morning. But Now, I had a story, and I've lost it again. It came back and then went again. Oh, yes. Had some fun with this. Who was the last, and you won't, I don't think anyone will get this, who was the last person to drive in the Indianapolis 500 and actually was a resident of Speedway at the time? And to clarify that, they were renting, but it wasn't just an overnighter. But there was a driver that lived in Speedway for several months and drove in the Indianapolis 500 as a temporary Speedway resident.
Chuck Rhodey.
Way later than that. Rhodey owned a home. Simone de Silvestro. And somebody said, and they said, did you know, we think Simona's living in Speedway. There's a big motorhome always parked there, but on a race weekend, it's gone. And a couple of other people said, well, I've seen her out running. And I said, well, I live on 14th Street and I've never seen her. So I asked her, and she said, I'm living in Carmel now, but yes, I did live in Speedway with my dad for a while. And so that's way later than most of the ones you'd think. But it was really great, and this is a whole other thing about, I've got a lot of stories about drivers living in Speedway. But golly, you would go up and down Main Street when things were looking very different in the 60s and 70s, and you'd see drivers getting their hair cut, and the drugstore where Dawson's is now. And there's a little bit of trivia. Maybe some of you know this, or maybe I'm talking too much here, but there was Rossner's Drugstore, and they had a fountain, but they were high stools only. If you went down to 15th and Main, and I don't remember what that was called by this time, but they actually, well, it had been Beck's, but Beck's had then moved to, thank you, 16th and Lyndhurst, yeah. But that had been Beck's, but now it was called something else. But they actually had a fountain with booths, and you could actually sit with your feet on the floor, and you'd see all kinds of people in there. Anyway, the trivia about Beck's drugstore, and maybe somebody can correct me on this, because I'm learning all the time, and I want to know what I didn't know. Somebody told me that Beck's was actually Rossner's, that there was a division in thinking with the family, and so some of them split off and moved down one block and opened a drugstore, but they couldn't call it Rossner's, so they used Beck's, which was a family name. And although it was a Rossner's store, there was no member of the Beck family had anything to do in that business. And then at some point, then they moved to 16th and 16th and thank you. Brain fade. Yes, sir.
I cut Thelma Beck's yard for, I don't know, probably almost 10 years.
I didn't get any.
Mowing when I was growing up.
Yeah.
I knew her very well.
He cut her grass.
What?
He cut her grass in her yard for many years.
Oh, all right then. All right. Well, thank you. I'm glad you're here, because I'm sorry I couldn't get any of that. All right. Is everybody okay with this? Because I'm happy to keep going. All right. I mean, does anybody actually want to talk about motor racing, or if you want to talk about Speedway, that's fine with me. Yes, sir.
You are talking about Main Street.
Yes.
On the alley behind the west side of Main Street,
Yes.
there was a garage.
Yes.
I believe it was
Kepler's.
called Kepler's.
Yes.
Kepler's. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. Kepler's was, there were several short track people used the place. I don't think there was ever a championship dirt car in there, but there were sprints and midgets. And I think that there was room for like maybe 2 sprint cars and 3 or 4 midgets or something. So I think half a dozen would be bursting at the seams, but several people would keep their cars there. And up and down the alleys, Jack McGrath had a Hudson stock car down in an alley in like 13th or 14th. But anyway, Kepler's was just this hive of activity, and then everybody would set off and go to the races. I do know that the kids would ride their bikes down there. You were one of them?
Yes.
All right, and then so you probably knew Buzz Gregory.
Well,
No?
I don't know.
No, all right. Well, Stephen Buzz Gregory, who was actually, Jack McGrath called him Little Buzz because he had a short temper, and there was a driver named Buzz Spartan that would fly off the handle all the time. But anyway, the parents didn't like the kids riding the bikes down there because some of the kids would hear words they'd never heard before. And so a driver named Johnny Tolan, who drove in the 500 3 times, but was a very successful midget car driver, was one of those fellows that blasphemed, not out of a bad temper, but his every sentence was laced with several bad words, to the point where it was, and I don't know if this makes any sense, but I've known people that blaspheme that you couldn't take exception to. And I've seen young ladies around and they don't bat an eyelid because it sounds so natural, they don't accept. Well, anyway, Johnny Tolan was one of those. And Buzz Gregory started working for Tolan and like washing parts and stuff like that. And I think he was like 8. And I can't imagine some of the words that he picked up before he was even 10 years old. But I don't know how late that went. When I showed up in '64, that had just recently stopped. But I don't know when it started, but probably 48, 49. And I think all the way through the 50s, you'd and then here would be the drivers working on their own cars, and then visitors coming and going all the time. Do you have any stories?
Well, it seems like I remember A.J. Foyt and Roger Ward in there working, but it was kind of hard to tell because they didn't have good lighting. And when you're riding your bicycle down the alley, they didn't like you to stop and stare. So you had to stop and sneak.
All right. Well, that would surprise me if Ward or Foyt were in there regularly. Now Ward, actually, Roger Ward, where Jim Bob Lubert's stitching post is now, or I don't think they call it the stitching post, that was a gas station, and Roger Ward and A.J. Watson were partners in that gas station and garage, and Chuck Rohde was in the service department. And then they also had, next to USAC, there used to be several buildings. There was, I love this one, Arthur Bloom Florist. Remember that? B-L-U-M, but Arthur Bloom Florist. And then there was a building on the corner that was like triangular shaped, and when I showed up, it was an archery place. Anybody remember that?
Sutphen's.
What was it?
Sutphen's. Sutphen, it had been a hardware store and then a...
Well, at one time, that was a Roger Ward and A.J. Watson speed shop, because Johnny Parsons Jr. Worked there as a kid after school. It would surprise me if Ward or Foyt were in that Kepler's, because well, maybe, but I think it was mostly the midget and sprint regulars. A little Chuck Rohde story. He lived at it was like 1200 something Nestor, that little street that is like about a half a block long. And he lived down at the end, and the kids we're all pretty much hellions, I think, and the property next to it was known as Rhodey's Field, but that was just a nickname. And so Chuck Rhodey, as with a number of the drivers, was very mechanically inclined, and he did his own preparation. In fact, I think he looked after 2 or 3 cars. In addition to driving them, he would prepare the one that he was driving, but then he would do 1 or 2 others. And so once in a while, a job was completed late in the evening, and they would fire it up. And not all of the neighbors were thrilled about that. And then sometimes, just to make sure that it was running okay, they might run it up and down the street. And so apparently some of the people that were not amused would call the police station, and so they'd send over an officer. In fact, at one time, I think there were 3 cops. Anybody, that's going way back into the 50s. There was a chief and 2 deputies and 1 car. Anyway, so the force would have been a little larger, but so anyway, they would call the police station, and so an officer would go over, and it's Chuck Rhodey, so they'd hang out. And then, half an hour would go by, and then another officer would show up to find out what happened to the first one, and then they'd get into big conversation. But it was always kind of turn the blind eye. Yes, sir?
Yeah, Chuck Rhodey's youngest son was my best friend. And he and I were standing in the snake pit in 1966, watching him attempt to qualify. He backed it into the wall on the outside and died right before our eyes.
I remember that very well. In fact, I was actually sitting on the pit wall when he got in the car and went out to make that attempt. Does anybody remember the Reverend James Grottek? He was a Brit who was at the Methodist Church. And in fact, he did the wedding ceremony for my wife and I. Anyway, Jan Rhodey would go down from time to time because how many Rhodey boys? There were 3 or 4 and 1 girl, or it was more than 2. But anyway, so I guess they were hellions. And so she went down to see the Reverend Grottek and was talking about the struggles that she was having with them. And he said, "My dear woman, they're Chuck Rhodey's sons. What do you expect?" Oh dear. Oh, this is being televised, isn't it? Oh my God. All right. What do you want to talk about? And if you've got stories for me, I want to know what I didn't know. Yes, ma'am.
Whatever became of the signs that were along, I guess it was 16th Street, there were the race cars of the individual drivers?
I know that some of them are in private collections, and I don't know if they were officially taken down. There was a fellow named, was it Shoesmith, I think, was a gentleman that...
Jim Schoonover.
Shoemaker, I was thinking it wasn't quite that, but anyway, I met him, and I think, did he work for either Allison's or Prestolite or something like that? And he would paint those, one on each side, and he was really good with the colors. And I don't know, one way or the other, I don't know that he was ever paid for those. I don't know whether he just did those on his own or if the town board gave him anything at all for doing that. But there were quite a few of them around, and occasionally you'd see one hanging by, it was on, by one chain, and then they would get blown down. And so I know of a few that are in private collections. And then at some point, I don't know if they changed the light posts or what, and then they all came down. but once in a while one will show up on eBay. Yep, remember those very well. All right. Yes, sir.
Back to libraries, how many books have you written? Because I know you got books in the library here.
There's, well, I've been involved in a few. I think the autocourse official history of the Indianapolis 500 is in there. And then I did another one about A.J. Watson's, the 1964 winning Roadster. And I'm not sure if that's in there or not. And then I'm actually in the credits for quite a few, but I'd have to go and look and see what's on the shelf these days. But there's a few. Yes, sir.
So Donald, I see you're wearing an Indianapolis Motor Radio Network jacket.
Oh, thank you. All right.
Do you have a favorite story from the radio days or the TV days?
Oh, yeah, I decided, and I don't know if it was a good choice or not. I think I'd even forgotten I put it on. I thought for something a little bit different, I would wear a retro jacket. So this is probably from about 88 or 89, that's longer ago than it seems like. But yeah, that was the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Radio Network logo. Stories about the network.
Or TV, like a favorite broadcasting event you were part of.
Favorite broadcasting event? Boy, that's hard.
How about the qualifying show?
Oh, well, that was beyond the radio network. Is anybody aware of the racers get together down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area each year? Is there anybody that might know about those? No. Okay, well then never mind. This gentleman who I've known for several years puts that on. And also was in the recording business, the record industry for many, many years, and spent a lot of time with a very young Michael Jackson, and has got some phenomenal stories. Anyway, we were talking earlier about some of the more enjoyable things that I did. Working qualifications for WIBC with Lou Palmer was a treat. I did 18 years. I was paired with Lou Palmer, and then it was Bob Lamey for 8, and there's been a variety since. But just working qualifications was a blast with Lou Palmer, who had a most amazing mind. What I was talking with him earlier about was the qualification shows on old Channel 4. I still can't get that straight. By the way, little editorial comment there. When 6 and 13 switched ABC and NBC, I was okay with that. But I still can't get used to the fact that if you want to watch CBS Sunday morning, you go to Channel 4 and Channel 8 and you know, they're connected with Fox 59. What the hell's going on? I can't get it straight. But anyway, back from 1988, 84 to 88, which was actually 5 seasons, I was paired with Gary Lee on qualification highlights on Channel 4. And that's about the most fun I've ever had. I mean, what exciting times those were when, if the weather was nice, and you'd go out and I would do qualifying all day on WIBC, which isn't WIBC anymore. It's still 1070, but anyway, so we did that all day. And then I would have a short break, and then I would do the Talk of Gasoline Alley when it was on, from coming out of the 6 o'clock news until 7. And then I would go home and change clothes and then go down to Channel 4 on Bluff Road, which isn't there anymore. Bluff Road's there, but the building is gone. And sometimes I feel like I'm Rip Van Winkle or living in the Twilight Zone because everything's knocked down. So anyway, I would get down there to Channel 4, and that was a really fun little building with the amount of creativity that came out of there. And Sammy Terry, was a big part of Channel 4. In fact, off the tangent a little bit, when the crew wanted to take a nap, or anybody wanted to take a nap down at Channel 4, do you know where they took their naps? In the coffin. That is a true story. And I had a lady tell me when I told that at an event one time, and she said, well, that's true. She said, because we'd get ready for the show and there'd be newspapers in there and potato chip bags and stuff like that. But anyway, so I'd go down to Channel 4, and it was live from 9 until 10. And I would get down there probably about 8:30, and then we would do the quick run through. And I was telling Bart, we had no script. We had the running order, but all of the intros and all of the link ups and everything were all ad libs. We didn't have a teleprompter, and so we would. They'd give us a quick run through, tell us what was in the program, and then we would go down to the men's room and straighten each other's tie and comb our hair and use each other for a mirror. And then we would go down and then actually be making the show up as we were going along. There'd be a piece on, and we're in a break, and then they say, all right, when we come back, we're going to do the George Snyder piece, or we're going to do the Rich Vogler piece. Who's going to intro that? All right, do you ever know? Yeah, all right, you do that, and then I'll do Grant King. And we would just have a rough idea. They tell us how long, and it was so rewarding because all of the features were not what you would normally see. We would go to, Watson's shop and all of this, and I just try not to be over the top on this, but it was so flattering that when we would come back to the track the next day, it seemed like everybody watched the show. And Tom Keating, who was a really great guy, and I'm sure I see the nodding heads, what a wonderful writer, what a passionate humanitarian he was. And he loved sports and racing. And so he called me and he said, I love you guys' show. Now back then, it was 6, 8, 13, and 4. And he said, I flipped the channels, and he said, it seems like all of the qualification wrap-up shows, he said they have an interview with Penske, and then there's something about Lola, and then the last few minutes of the program is the driver expert that they have for the month, justifying why he hasn't qualified for the show yet. And then he said, but I watch you guys, and he said it's all about the lesser lights, and he said you go run by run, and he said every time I have a question, it's almost answered immediately, and it sounds like a canned piece, Bart, because that's basically what I was telling you. But then to come back to the track the next day, and it was just very, very rewarding, really exciting times. And I actually, sentimental old silly that I am, I actually went down Bluff Road a few times, and I would pull into the parking lot, and it was all overgrown, and the parking lot had rubble and stuff in it, and I would just sit there and shut my eyes and feel the vibes from back on what really exciting times those were. The shows were just such fun to do. And if you did Saturday, then you'd come back, and then all day with Palmer again. Some of the Palmer phraseology was, the car is red, the helmet is yellow, and the flag is green. Yes. And he said this one time, yellow flag in hand. Will they take it? Yes, the checkered flag. And do they wave him off? No, they do not. They say, congratulations, man, you've qualified. I probably didn't do that one very well. But this one day, and so, you know, some people have their pet phrases and they keep using them over and over and over. One day, I was sitting with them, and he was sort of like doing a review of the day, and somebody had been injured the day before, and they weren't sure if he was going to run or not, but we got the word that he's been cleared and he'll be out later. And so he said, it seemed serious at first, but the wound was examined, and it was not as deep as a well, nor as wide as a church door, which was out of Romeo and Juliet. I'm sorry, I flubbed that one a little bit, but I just laughed. And I never heard him use it again, but God, what a delight he was, because you never knew what was going to happen. And he would stand up, put one foot on the stool, and normally rap the table with a pencil while he was doing his bit. And you know that a lot of people have a rough idea on what they were going to say. And so if you've seen outtakes of when somebody is trying to do a news piece, and maybe they do 3 or 4 takes, they start out the same way. They pretty much memorize what they're going to say. With Palmer, it was totally off the top of his head, because when he would flub, when he was recording a piece and he would flub, which wasn't very often, he'd say, I'm sorry, man, we're going to have to start again. Whenever you're ready, at your convenience, 3, 2, 1, and and you better be ready. And then the second take was just a completely different, opening. Don't know if that means anything or not. So, all right, we'd better move on to something else. Questions, comments?
You gave me, when I was about 6 years old in 1946.
Yes.
My father, and I grew up in Terre Haute, took me down to a Ford store, which was in a building, and they had Maury Rose's race car, was I believe the 46 winner.
Well, Rose won in 47 to 48.
Oh, 47, so maybe it was, you can see my memory doesn't keep up with yours.
They actually, I don't know whether it was that early, there was a little museum down there, which I think they called Early Wheels, and it was a store that was abandoned, and Tony Holman had some cars in there on 7th and Wabash, or whatever the address was over there.
Well, another thing, that Channel 4 on Bluff Road, if I might be mistaken, but I think that was the first where in Terre Haute, we didn't have our own TV station yet. That was the first time we could get a signal with no snow. Now that's not true today, because as you said, 4 is in a different place.
Channel 4 was the first station in this area to be granted a license. It was Sarkis Terzian. And but I think the transmitter was in Bloomington to start with, and that's why you had the snow going when you were trying to watch the program.
That's why we could get it, because see, I was in Terre Haute, and they ran this big advertising thing in the newspaper, showed the pattern of how reception, and that was the first time anybody in Terre Haute, Indiana, had a TV set, got to see a clear picture. Now today, we take all that stuff for granted.
Well, 4 was the first. They were granted the first license, but they weren't the first on the air. That was Channel 6, and Channel 6 actually debuted on race day 1949. And I think they'd been on the air for a couple of days, because like on qualifying days, they were doing testing. And so there would actually be TV, but it was just sort of the camera would be moving around all like this because they were just experimenting. And then they officially went on the air on race morning, and they ran a film called The Crucible of Speed, which was a Firestone documentary about the history of racing and tires. And then they went out to the track for live coverage of the Indianapolis 500 with 3 cameras, and they were all on the straightaway. I think that there was one in turn 1, and then the 2 others were on the straightaway. And I don't know if they had commercial breaks. I think they pretty much went all day. And then by 1950, then they had regular programming, and so I think they would go out to the track for visits. And then in 51, there was no TV because they were getting the impression that it was hurting the live gate.
Because today, we don't get to see it live.
Yeah.
In the area. Right. And by the time it's going to be shown, we've already heard it on the radio. Yeah. And I have no interest in going because I know who won.
Does anybody still listen to the race on the radio? Oh, bless you. Okay. Because we don't get the feedback like we used to. And I thought, this is fun to do this show, but is anybody listening? Apparently the answer is yes. All right, I'll tell you what, I'm having a ball doing this. It's just after 20 to 4. Why don't we just take 1 or 2 quickies, and then I'm in no rush to leave, so I'll be happy to do one-on-ones with you. I don't know if this is what you wanted or if you had any idea or what, but I just like telling stories and hearing them.
See us when you can stay long.
Oh, well, I'll stay as long as you want. Yes.
The race is going to NBC next year. Do you see any difference, or does it make any difference?
Is what now?
It's going to NBC. ABC won't have the race anymore.
Yeah. I thank you for all of your years at the library, by the way. That's a good question. I have heard nothing yet, but it's ABC done it since. Well, actually, 1965, they would do segments, and then it was part of Wide World of Sports. Yes. And then in 1971 was the first year that they did the entire race, but it wasn't live. The track didn't want to do live, and so they did the taped, edited version that would run that night in prime time. And then 86, they went live. And it rained out. Little trivia there, 1986, the race was rained out, postponed to the next day and rained out again. And apparently the rain out on the first day, to date, was the largest viewing audience they ever had was for the rain out. But anyway, now that it's NBC, they've had experience doing races. But how it will be, all I know is a fellow named Mike Wells, who did their NASCAR coverage for years, is going to be the lead producer. But other than on-air people, you just have to figure it out. I mean, none of the ABC, Scott Goodyear and Eddie Cheever both said, we've got contracts with ABC, so we couldn't if we wanted to. And so, my guess would be it would be the NBC crew right now, with Kevin Lee, who's a Ben Davis guy. I would imagine would have a role, and then Townsend Bell, and then Paul Tracy was the driver expert, except that recently he's made some unfortunate comments on tweets and hasn't learned the lesson that have bitten a lot of people. So I'm not sure, and this is off the record, I don't know what his situation is, but he's being called for inappropriate comments that were politically incorrect, and whether he can survive that or not, I don't know. And I probably shouldn't have said that on tape, but I haven't heard any rumors about Brent Musburger or
Well, he was CBS, you know.
Well, I know. I just was trying to think of a big name where somebody comes in and are part of it, and they've never been here before. Had a few of those.
Will the radio network still be the same? Or you still
Yes.
Yeah, the radio network will be the same, except that they'll be in a different location. They were on the 9th floor of the pagoda, and the Brickyard 400, NBC came in and decided they wanted the radio broadcast view, and so the radio broadcast crew are down now on the 2nd floor, and I imagine that we'll stay there. But it's actually very similar to the view that the Master Control Tower point had, because I don't remember how many floors that was. It like 5 floors, I think, was the Master Control Tower, but it wasn't a very big building. And so with the broadcast level was just, you know, right on top of the pits. But as far as personnel, it's the same. Mark James and Jake Query and Kristen Airy and Matt Yeoman. If I don't get into trouble for comments that I've made here today, hopefully I'm still part of it. And
How about Dave Cassidy?
How about
Dave Cassidy?
Dave Cassidy? Dave Cassidy wasn't on the radio network. Dave Cassidy was an integral Holman person who was a friend of Mary George when she was Miss Mary Holman, and he came into the organization as somebody that was able to do about anything, and he was like a son to Tony Holman. And there was Bob Cassidy, and Dave Cassidy were not related. In fact, Cassidy was actually spelt differently. And but anyway, Dave Cassidy was, he went wherever they needed him. And he was the manager of the Speedway Motel when it opened. And so when the Beatles stayed there one night in September of '64, David Cassidy gave me a lot of inside stories about that. He was the manager.
I heard that story, I could tell you.
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm going to go into that now, because we're kind of, in fairness to everybody, kind of running out of time. But he was the manager of the Coke plant. He was the head of concessions. And basically, wherever Tony Holman needed him, that's where he went. He was actually a stooge for Dwayne Carter when Dwayne Carter was driving sprint cars. But David Cassidy was somebody I miss a lot, because he knew all the inside stuff, and he was a wonderful source. Just not only on the track, but just Indianapolis in general. I mean, if you wanted to know where was such and such a building, and I mean, he knew all of the players. Just a very, very, and then.
Actually, Betty Thompson, the founder of the library, was actually his secretary at Coca-Cola.
Here's what now?
She was his secretary at Coca-Cola.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I'm looking at you. Say again, please.
Betty Thompson, the founder of the library, was his secretary at Coca-Cola.
I meant to mention that. Yeah, Betty Thompson was his secretary at the Coke plant, and yes, I meant to mention that earlier on when she was, mentioned in the proclamation. Yeah. She was another great source. All right, I'll tell you, how about one more? And I hope I didn't overstay my welcome here. Anyone? Yes, sir.
So can you tell a story about it? This was when Jim Herpes was still...
Oh, no. Is this the beer story?
Yeah, when he had the beer in the engine compartment or something.
A long time ago, in doing Q&A, the fatal comment was, we've just got time for one more question, and that's the one you don't want to take. I will never learn why it's either, if we've just got time for one more, It's either a turban question or Foyt or Hurtubise and the beer. All right. This story got blown out a little bit out of proportion, but it is true. And I tell it with some reluctance because it's been told over and over and over again. In 1972, Hurtubise still had the front engine car, but he was no longer seriously trying to qualify it. And in fact, he had already qualified for the 72 race with a rear engine car. He was in the show. And on the last day, when things were a little more loose, the Roadster was rolled out. And you know, we don't do this anymore, but it used to be on the last day, all these cars would come out, and some of them didn't have a prayer, but they'd line them up anyway. And so what Hurtubise did was to put the thing in line, and so the officials at the other end of the line said, well, you know, what are you doing? Well, I've got it here in case somebody needs a ride that got bumped or something like that. With that? Anyway, so they pushed it, and he had actually put it in line strategically so that it wouldn't get to the front of the line before 6 o'clock. And so when the gun went off to end qualifications for 72, I think it was 5th in line, and then and it was called the Miller High Life Special, except that it wasn't Miller High Life from Milwaukee. It was actually Dick Hammond, who was a distributor from Buffalo, New York. And so anyway, they opened up the hood to reveal that there was no engine, but it was lined with plastic sheets, and there was a bunch of ice in there and Miller High Life beer. And so he said, you want a beer? Want a beer? And so the crowd, a lot of people thought it was funny. Some of the officials didn't. And there was a rule the following year that you had to have practiced at a reasonable speed in order to get a sticker that would allow you to get in the qualifying line. But yeah, that one comes up a lot. But it is a true story. In fact, one of the crew members actually lives in this area, and I wouldn't have been surprised if he was here today, but he was not. Anyway, it is 10 to 4. You've been very patient here, and again, I hope this was something close to what you wanted, or if there was something enjoyable in there. And if you want to hang around, all right, thank you. I will be happy to stick around here on a more informal basis. And thank you, everybody that's involved with the library. We love the library. Thank you.
Thank you very much.